our second panel, then, are three water policy experts who've been involved in Delta issues and water issues in California for a long time. And I'd like to introduce them and ask them to come on up. We're really grateful to have with us today Ellen Hannock from the Public Policy Institute of California. She's the senior fellow there, leads the Institute's research program on water policy, and has been an author or co-author of dozens of reports about the Delta and California water. Cindy Tuck's with us. She's the associate from the Association of California Water Agencies, where she's their deputy executive director. She used to be the undersecretary of the California EPA, so she's been on your side of the table as staff to the Cal EPA, as well as representing agencies now appearing before us who are members of ACWA. And then Alf Brandt is with us. He's the legislative director for Assemblyman Anthony Rendon, who chairs the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee. Alf played a key role in the staff work that supported the passage of the Delta Reform Act. And he also is, interestingly, executive director of the National Judicial College's Dividing the Waters program, which is a network of judges that adjudicate complex water litigation. And we've asked them all to come and talk with you about potential roles that the council should be playing and authorities it could use to assist in the Delta Plan's implementation. And maybe we'll start with Alf, and then we can just work on down the aisle there.
Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity. Am I on now? Can you hear me now? Okay. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you today to talk a little bit about the Delta Reform Act, which I didn't have the opportunity to play on. I'm here today more as a historian, or perhaps a source of history, a primary source of history, or perhaps just a witness to history. I was in the middle of this in the Delta Reform Act in 2009. At that point, I was the Water, Parks, and Wildlife consultant, and I was the lead on the Assembly side, one of a couple of leads on staffing, on writing a lot of this stuff from the Assembly's perspective. And today I'm legislative director for Assemblyman Anthony Rendon, who chairs the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee. But let me be clear, I am not here in my role as legislative director for Mr. Rendon. I'm here to share with you kind of what we were doing in 2009. It's more of a historical perspective. It's not about where he is. We have 38 new members in the Assembly.
Judge, can you give the witness immunity?
Thank you, Senator Johnston. We are in the middle of just starting an education process on a lot of these issues. With 38 new members in the Assembly, we have a lot of work to do in the year ahead. So, and I'll be involved in all those kinds of things as well. Let me offer a perspective on kind of the history, because I think in understanding what happened in 2009 is an important part of looking forward, of moving forward. When you know your history, you know where you can go and where you need to go, and perhaps how you can do it. And I think I can help on that. I worked a lot with both I was on Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee staff, so I worked with the chair, who was Jared Huffman, but I also worked closely with the speaker, Speaker Karen Bass at that time, on helping her work through these issues. And I emphasize, I was probably one of the lawyers. There were a few lawyers who were involved in this staff group that did a lot of the development of this language. And a couple things you need to understand. Had very consciously on my mind some of the canons of judicial interpretation of legislative interpretation. And one of them is the plain meaning. And if you're not going to use a plain meaning, and there's a lot of jargon in water, then you're going to need to define it. And so we spent a lot of time on our definitions. Another one is you look at the entire statute. And this is the entire statute. It includes more than just the council. It includes Delta Protection Commission, some changes there. It includes creating a Delta Conservancy. But even think about the context of what we were passing at that point. There were other bills. They were all part of the package. They were all part of one special session. They were all passed within about 24 hours on November 3rd and November 4th. So all of those are part of what we were doing. And we used language, and we took language from one piece and used it for the other. In conservation, we used some language that we used in the Delta bill. We used that in the conservation bill. We took pieces of the conservation bill, put it into one of the priorities for what we were doing in the Delta as far as water conservation. So we look at all those pieces. Now, granted, if you look, as you get closer, it's probably more important. So yes, there are a number of pieces, more than the Delta Reform Act in the Delta bill. But as you get into the division that is the Delta Reform Act, then anything in there is part of the same statute, because we called it one thing, but all of them are connected. And finally, most importantly, is administrative deference, is the deference that when there is an ambiguity, if you're not using the plain meaning, you rely on the administrative agency to interpret that and define that, and there is a lot of judicial deference. And to give you some context for both what we were doing and where I came from coming into this, one is the California Bay Delta Authority and CalFed had failed. I wrote much of the hundreds of pages of the CalFed record of decision in 2000. I was the lead for the federal government. I was also, one of my responsibilities at that point was governance. I was the lead on governance and protecting our sovereignty, protecting agencies, so that ultimately, however we worked together, the agencies did not lose their authority to make decisions. And so that was an important part of where we were focused, completely different focus than where we were with the Delta Stewardship Council. And also, I had litigated an important and controversial part of something called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act for a couple of years, and that was a lot about, and we were focused on protecting the Secretary of the Interior's, who I worked for, who I was a lawyer for, his discretion on interpreting where there was ambiguity. And most of the time we did okay on that in front of Judge Wanger. But that constant, and those kind of arguments were constantly on my mind in thinking about how we were writing and what we were doing and how we were defining things and what authorities we gave you and all those kinds of pieces. That was constantly, all those pieces fit into what was going into what we were going to do with creating the Delta Stewardship Council. And the other key fact that comes in that creates the context is what happened with the Delta programs, what happened with the Bay Delta Authority, the Little Hoover Commission's assessment and report on governance in the Delta. I perhaps was the one that was most frustrated with this, was the interagency conflict. And I was just tired of it. And I'll tell you the one story that was a key part of driving my thinking was a conflict that happened in 2006. We got a report on August 18th of the Delta ecosystem collapsing in 2005. The next year, in the next year's budget for 2006-2007, we put a requirement in that the Secretary of Resources had to come up with a plan to just stabilize the Delta while we figured out what we were going to do. We just come up with options for how to stabilize the Delta. We gave it to the Secretary of the Resources Agency, which is unusual because generally it's the agencies, not the Secretary, that does those kinds of things. But we gave it to him because we wanted him to craft it. Well, and we they couldn't do the South Delta Improvement Program. They couldn't spend any state money on South Delta Improvement Program. The contractors or the DWR could not until that report was done. That report did not get done until March of the next year. And I was regularly talking to the directors of Fish and Game and DWR who were at war with each other. And I was hearing about how horrible the other side was, and their staff was at war. They were at war. Personally, it was frustrating, and we couldn't get anything out of them. And we couldn't get anything to just stabilize the Delta. What do we do to just hold things in as we figure out what to do? And that frustration of that experience was part of what I was keeping in mind clearly as we were trying to figure out how do we create a council that has some authority. And we heard Senator Machado regularly talk about the authority without the authority. And that's something that we had in mind as we did that. So that's just a piece. And so looking at your plan, I'm not going to comment a whole lot, but it is consistent with the kinds of things that we gave you. We gave you a lot of discretion. We left it to you. The legislature was not going to make the decisions on exactly how to go forward. We gave it to you. We set out things that you needed to consider. We set standards. We did a number of things. But ultimately, it was up to you. So you made choices. And I don't think we gave you options, not mandates. You have to decide this way. And that's what I see a lot in the Delta plan, the plan that you are considering adopting shortly. You are focused on the equal goals. You're looking at all the policies, the entire part of the Delta Reform Act, all the different policies. All those are tied together. So I see the plan overall as doing those kinds of things. and I'm not going to get into details about exactly what those decisions are, or those kinds of things. That's not my role. But I think what I'm going to talk about, focus on, if I can, rather quickly, is the planning piece of this, because that's one of the important parts of your role. I think Ellen may talk a little bit about implementation and relationships with the local agencies, but I want to talk a little bit about the role and the authorities that you have on planning, because I think that's a central piece. Planning can make a difference, and being able to set a plan for all the different pieces of the Delta, not just water, not just fish, but all the different pieces, and you see a lot of land use in that. You're one of 3 organizations. We did change the DPC to make it more focused on the counties, so that was the county's voice, and that's the piece that we heard repeatedly from them. That was really where we focused on Delta Protection Commission. Delta Conservancy, that was the implementer for a lot of the both ecosystem restoration as well as economic development in Delta. So those were the implementers. We didn't see you as an implementer. You're one of 3. But the planning is the piece where you can really step up, and you have stepped up. But I think about the things that are in the bills, like in 85002, you're directing efforts across state agencies. That was an important part of it. You are developing a legally enforceable Delta plan. That was to contrast with the Bay Delta Authority, which didn't really have any effect to be able to enforce it. And we wanted to say intent to you had the authority, the responsibility, and the accountability. Because that was one of the frustrations in 2005 and 2006. There was no accountability. It's their problem. It's their fault that the Delta's failing. And so there was all this so we wanted one place where we could eventually go to and say, so what's happening? How's your plan working? And somewhere to put some accountability. And notice that we put on a full-time chair. This is not like the Water Commission. It is a full-time chair. You are 1/3 time, consistent, kind of like CARB. We took that out of the CARB model. So you are a hard-working leadership council. It's more than just a voluntary kind of when you have time. Delta policies. We put a lot of those Delta policies, and that's part of the package that you are dealing with. And I'm glad to see that you're dealing with these. Yes, co-equal goals and conservation and quality and reduced reliance on the Delta. Those are all part of the package. It's all part of one act. Land use policies. You'll see that repeatedly. We took a piece of the Coastal Act, actually, for some of the policies and adjusted them for the Delta. So land use was an important part of it. And finally, we put reasonable use and public trust as the foundation of how we manage water in California. All those are part of the act, and all those are things that we wanted you to pay attention to. We weren't telling you exactly how that meant or how you implement it, but we were telling you these are things that you need to pay attention to. On Delta Plan, it is the plan of plans. Only the council, this was a decision we made at one point, only the council is the one who adopts the plans. There was some discussion about having, DWR will do the water reliability plan, and Fish and Game will do that. We didn't do that. We chose not to do that. We took that out of an earlier draft. So only the council does it. So yes, the Delta Protection Commission does submit things, and the Caltrans submit things just partly to get their attention that there was even an issue on state highways in the Delta, and state parks does a plan as well. So all those were contributing, but only the council is the one who takes together what other people's plans are and puts them in, and how do you make those all work together. That's up to you, and it's ecosystem and water supply reliability. So all that planning, your plan is the key piece, is your key tool. And we added a lot of things in there for you to consider, like the strategic plan from the Delta Vision Task Force. But the other piece of it is, in the plan is the next step. And this is partly implementation, but partly it's about how you implement your plan and your planning efforts going forward once you adopt a Delta plan. We put in there, you can request reports from state and federal agencies. You can comment on state agencies' ER outside of the Delta if it's connected to the Delta. You're required to review and provide timely advice to local planners. And this was adoption or recognition of the SB 375 by Senator Steinberg from a few years before about regional planning. And then also you get reports from the Delta Water Master. You have the Delta Science Plan, science program, which helps you coordinate. So that role of review, comment, and coordination can be an important tool for you. And it depends on how you decide to act and what you decide to review. We didn't tell you exactly which ones you have to review, but we left that to you. But we gave you the authority to go even outside the Delta. You have to make certain determinations, but you can go outside. If it's going to affect the Delta, you can do that. And that kind of review and comment and coordination can be a critical tool for you going forward once you adopt the Delta plan. And with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, we set out, in that case as well, we didn't say exactly how we were going to do that or how the state was going to do that, but we set out the procedures, open process, and we set out some of the substantive considerations, things that the agencies who are doing that had to do, and then gave it to you to appeal on those things. Have they done those things? Have they done those considerations? Have they considered those issues? Have they done the process that is an open process? So that is up to you, and I have to admit the appeal that was something we added in the final weeks before September 11th, which was when we brought it all together. That was something we, anyway, I'll just, how do I say we didn't, there's not a whole lot of detail, I acknowledge, on that. And I'll leave that to you. And I think part of us, we actually talked about this among staff, was, well, we're just going to leave it to the council to figure it out. So, that was an example where we're relying on your discretion, and you'll need to figure out how that works.
Alf, it was probably about 4 o'clock in the morning at that point. You decided we'd rather just finalize things and let them worry with those details later.
I think that's probably not too far from wrong. But, and then is there life after adoption of the Delta Plan? I would say yes. And, we put some limits on what your role is after that. And I'll leave this more. No, you're not an implementer, and you cannot direct an agency, require them to do something. That was a conscious choice, and took out earlier provisions that had that in there. But you also have the opportunity for plan consistency. But it's the planning, it's getting up front before it gets to you as a consistency appeal that it can be some of your most powerful roles. So I would encourage you to go ahead and plan. And plan is where you can make the biggest difference. It's where you can bring all of our agencies, state and federal. And let me note an example, for instance, that was one piece of mine. My key addition was all the requirements that you comply with federal law, that the plan, if you can, do your best. We didn't actually, in the end, we didn't require you, but do your best on applying the Coastal Zone Management Act and the Clean Water Act and the Section 8 of the Reclamation Act. Because as a former federal lawyer, I knew those were the hooks that we could get on the feds. If you could comply with those, if you could do things that exercise those authorities, that's the place where the federal government, Congress, has given us the authority as a state to be able to influence what the federal agencies do. So that was an important part. So your ability to make those part of the plan is going to make it work. Let me emphasize, the planning doesn't stop once you adopt it. I think that's the key role, and that's going to be your key challenge. Once you adopt the first Delta plan, planning doesn't stop. It keeps going, because the Delta, remember, Delta, what does Delta stand for? It stands for change. And that's, if anything, that's the one lesson I learned after CalFed, through CalFed and all that changed for the next 7 or 8 years, is that the Delta changes, and the Delta is going to change in ways you don't predict and in ways you can't expect. And we set you the biggest challenge of preparing for that change and responding and making the Delta resilient. How do you respond and how do you react to those changes? Because it was the failure in 2005 and 2006 for us to respond to the information that was coming in. Agencies weren't responding. So your challenge is, it's continued planning. It's how do you plan for change, and how do you plan and for resiliency and for those changes that are going to happen in the Delta. That's your challenge, and that's the ultimate challenge. I think planning is the key piece of how you can make a difference in the Delta.